Don't try to catch this criminal, he'll slip through your fingers, literally. Here's a look at the new Diamond Select. This is the Marvel Select Sandman Deluxe Collector's Figure. William Baker was born in Queens, New York, where he had a troubled upbringing. Falling into a life of crime, he went to jail, where he took the name Flint Marko as an alias. Upon his escape from prison, he fled to an irradiated beach used for atomic testing, where the sand bonded to his body, turning him into a man of living sand. His further criminal activity brought him into conflict with Spiderman and the Human Torch, and he later joined groups like the Frightful Four and the Sinister Six to challenge his old enemies. He has since spent time as an ally of Spiderman and even Reserve Avenger, but his recent change to his physiology have left his future uncertain. This 7-inch scale action figure of Sandman features 16 points of articulation and includes multiple interchangeable parts. Before we get a gander at Sandman, the first thing we're going to do is figure out how tall the figure stands. A service more than happy to oblige, stopping the Ultra Measure-tron to the very top of his head, and reading the display to you members of the mob. I can tell you that the figure stands 7.5 inches, or 7.5 inches. Exactly. Switching that over to centimeters, quickly, we're looking at a figure that stands 19.1, a little over 19 centimeters in height. My favorite Spider-Man villains of all time have always been Sandman, Mysterio, and Green Goblin. So you can imagine how excited I was with the idea that Diamond Select was going to be giving us a brand new Marvel Select Sandman. For the most part, I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. It does have a few problems and conflicts that we'll discuss over the course of this review, so stay tuned. In the meantime, though, let's have a look at the accessories that come included with the figure. I guess the first thing we can start with is the display stand. One of many different ways that you can display Flint Marko. The stand itself is just a straight circular or off-circle shaped stand. You can see that it's got some sand on the top, so you can almost depict or imagine, if you will, the sand is forming along the top as forming into the body of Flint Marko. Now the thing about it, though, is Sandman's lower legs, there's no way you can swap those out to the gradual changing of sand to body. But in the meantime, at the very least, you got a neat looking stand. I really like the texturing and added additional paint that they put to this. And there's a couple of pegs on the top there that you can stand the figure. So overall, I really like how this one turned out. We're going to put this stuff also to the side. One of the other display stands, if you want to consider a display stand, is the spiraled up sand that will form off to, well, the torso section of Sandman's body. This simply just involves you popping off. Don't worry, I'm not just going to simply describe it. We're going to look at it in a second. You just take the torso off of the lower legs, and then you just plunk the torso on top of that, and you got yourself a little display looking as if Sandman's formed himself out of the sand, possibly the sand from here. I guess you could put this on top. It doesn't really add or, I suppose, detract anything. It just is what it is. So again, you have two different ways you can display the figure. Then you move off to here. And let me draw your attention to the far right side of the screen, where you have a series of different constructs that Sandman has made to destroy the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Now, these seem as if you could mix and match them, and I suppose you could. The arms are sculpted in such a way that I guess it could be easily swappable on either side. He does come with, for example, this giant mace, very sharp, pointed mace. Not sharp enough that you're going to draw blood, but you certainly notice it when you put your hand against it, how sharp some of these are. They're not made of a soft, super soft plastic. In fact, some of these ones here, for example, I don't know if it's just the fact that some extra paint on it, that these ones don't have as much give and wiggle to some of the other ones here. Like this one here doesn't have any give to it. And I think it's just the fact that it was made of a softer plastic, and the paint has made it a little bit more rigid. This one's a little bit more softer, this one's a little bit softer, this one is ouchy ouchy. Again, it's got some nice detailing to it. You can see the individual grains of sand and the cracks and just all the neat stuff that you would expect a big ball of pointed sand should actually look like. And again, that's going to go onto Flint Marko's forearms. We'll talk about that in a second as well. Don't worry, we're gonna look at that. You also got this, kind of like a melee weapon, if you will. It's got spikes from top to bottom and all the way around. That's a prickly sort of thing that you could be adding to his forearms. Really, again, neat the amount of detail that they put into such a thing. Even if you look at each of the individual spikes, no spike is given up on paint and detail. Just as much care and sculpt into this one has been added to all the ones around and next door to it. Every one of the next door neighbors does get their own fair share of sculpt and paint. This attaches the exact way with all of these, basically. It's just a peg-to-hole system. You also get yourself a couple of sand-formed hands. One is a fist, one is a grabbing hand. And unfortunately, the one thing I don't care for is the fact that they didn't alternate these. They're designed for the same arm. If anything, they should have made it like this. So if you wanted to have strictly just sand hands and not human hands, you could go like this. But unfortunately, the thumb, as you can see, thumbsies go in. That's the rule of anatomy. It only can go on this one side. If anything, they should have made it so it could go like this. Because I would certainly display, I think, my Sandman with the hands like this. You could put it on this side, sure, if you wanted to. But anyone that knows anatomy, and I have very smart friends that seem to know very much about human anatomy, they probably would point out the fact that the fist is the wrong side. And I would probably have to tell them they would have to leave, and no juice boxes for you guys. You guys have to get out. But the hands themselves, I really like these hands also as well. I just really disappointed the fact that they have to be so allocated to one side. I get some close-up details of those. Again, really like the spiked nature, the pointed fingers that they went with on this particular hand here. And then you've got just the clubbing, big, giant oven mitt-sized fist. Also included with the figure, you get a series of gripping hands. I don't think they necessarily have mirror twins, but there are a pair of like kind of gripping hands. Mangling, strangling hands. And then he's also got like these hands here, some gesture hands. Ironically enough, some of these hands, like this one here, almost describes the fact a story is being painted out that Sandman should actually have something that he can hold, he can wield, maybe like a sand bat or a sand axe. But unfortunately, the figure doesn't come with anything else, so I'm not specifically sure what the purpose in the story is for this particular hand. This hand, I could just describe it as a gestured hand. I don't really know what's going on specifically with this hand. And again, all of those can go into place. There's a lot, like some stuff I want to talk about on this particular figure. For the most part, I like the design of it, but it does have a few problems that unfortunately can't be overlooked, so we're not going to overlook them on this review. The first thing I certainly want to talk about is the pros. The pros, if I can grab and pick up the figure, pros first and foremost, this is the sculpt of the head, which I have to come clean about. I didn't really like when I first saw images of the head. I think what I don't like about it is it's a different style of head than what we're so used to with many of the Marvel Select figures. It kind of has a more cartoon look to it, and even then it's not a look that I normally would pair with specifically Sandman. But then I got to thinking, if I was to pull a figure, for example, from the old classic 60s or so Spider-Man, when I think it was 66, I'm probably wrong by that, this would be kind of that Sandman from that era. It's almost a timeless kind of golden age version of Sandman. And when I start thinking that way is when I actually really do start liking the sculpt of this particular figure. Now, we've had Sandmans in the past. The Spider-Man Classics Sandman, which unfortunately I did part ways with. I kind of regret that after the fact, but that was the Toy Biz Spider-Man Classics Spider-Man. And we've gotten ourselves the Marvel Legends Sandman as well. But I think I like this one because it's got a little bit more personality, specifically to the face. The paint is really quite good. You've got some slightly more dirtied areas in the corners of the eyes that have been added with some additional brown wash. Other than that, though, I'm pretty happy with how this face turned out, in all honesty. And of course, you got the trademark clothing for Sandman, and that is the green alternating dark and light stripes. It's a shorter sleeved shirt, and you can probably start seeing maybe some of the problems I'm talking about right here. Right here, specifically right here. We'll talk about that more in a second. The stripes are generally pretty good. Paint seems a little bit rough at times, but you can imagine because it's Sandman, I don't think it maybe falls under the same ruling as some of the other figures that would be simply wearing clothing. This is sand, of course, that's formed into costumes. and clothing, so maybe I could chalk it up to the fact that the paint seems a little on the rough side. But again, I find I'm okay with that. That doesn't bother me too much. He's got a belted pair of slacks, kind of an alternating. It's not quite alternating, but there are little areas where it seems like it's slightly lighter than others. The pants themselves are almost a very dark purplish blue, or even almost a black. Not quite fully black. Maybe it's just the way that the lighting is hitting it. You've got natural draping and natural wrinkling forming on the pants. Those are always good. And you've got yourself some well-painted shoes, complete with the laces and the little silver added on the edges there on the sides. Even like the soles, they've sculpted not only well, but they've also painted those in a specific color, a different color than the blue or the brown that's on the top there. So at least it's a little bit of a breakup. Overall, like I said, I'm not happy. I'm not disappointed, specifically with the sculpt. You've got the trademark kind of, it's not woven, but you can see that there's almost a different weave to his hair, kind of like that he had in Spider-Man 3, the movie as well, which unfortunately was just a bad portrayal. Good actor picked for Sandman, but I really think Sandman should have been the sole villain in the movie and not start bringing in Venom, and certainly not bringing in New Goblin. Brought too much to the mix, and I think just watered down what could have potentially been a great movie had it only been solely just Sandman. Okay, we'll talk about the figure's articulation, and then we'll talk about some of the problems I have with the figure. The head rotates all the way around, it hinges up and down, and it has a little bit of a rock back and forth. The shoulders hinge up quite a bit actually, and that's the case on both sides, like that. And then you can rotate the arms all the way around. Swivel at the bicep, bend at the elbow. Now this is going to be where one of the problems comes. You can bend the elbow up. It's a little bit maybe easier if I do it on this side. Bend the elbow up. This one's just a little looser on this side, or a little tighter on this side. The natural swivel in the forearms only comes from the fact that you're going to be unpegging those arms anyways. And he has a swivel back and forth and a hinge back and forth on the hands. Upper torso is more so a ball joint than anything else. He has a mid-waist or waist swivel. Legs split out. There we go. Forward and back on the legs. Swivel on the 3/4 cut on the thigh. Double hinge on the knee. And he's got articulation not only forward and back on the feet, but also an ankle rocker as well. So you're not necessarily robbed on anything for articulation on the particular figure. Unfortunately, though, the biggest problem with Sandman here, the Marvel Select Sandman, is the fact that he doesn't feel like he stays together. Obviously, the big thing is that you're going to be trading him out with some of the other component pieces. And with that, it has to be an easy to swap out means. You simply can't just be having ball joints. Ball joints would be a harder thing, of course, to do because you're always having to force those on. So they ultimately went with pegs. Pegs are fine, but the problem is taking things like his torso off there's little to no effort involved to take the top torso off. I get, again, the idea that it has to be easy enough that you can change this out if you wanted to, but it ultimately does mean that when you are rotating the figure and just moving him around, the waist falls off or pops off way too easy for me. It's an acceptable means, though, when you compare it against the forearms, which for me is the biggest problem I have with this particular figure. You probably the whole time have been noticing that the forearm here has been leaving quite a bit of a gap from where the forearm of the flesh of the arm should be, and the striping of the sleeve should then start. Unfortunately, though, they are extremely loose. The idea is you're supposed to just pop them off, as you can see, and just replace them back on. But they never go back on the way that you want them to. Ultimately, they just sit really, really loose. And turning them, bending the elbows, for example, you'll find that these pop off way too frequently. I guess what I could do is add like a little bit of floor polish perhaps to the peg to maybe get a more solid grip when I'm eventually putting the forearm back in place. But then there is the rub. That's the big problem, because ultimately you're going to want to be changing the limbs out here easy enough to some of the other things that come included with the figure. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the things that you can do. We'll talk pulling the torso off, and we'll talk taking the bottom section of the sand, and you just pop that back onto his torso. There's not specifically one way to do it, although I do find this back section, let me just show you here, the one that has the more points. Seems to be more easier to put onto the front than the other way around. And again, you kind of have this neat looking sand effect where it looks like the sand has spiraled its way up, slithered its way up, and formed the top torso of Sandman. And again, I like that. Don't get me wrong. I like that. And I get the fact why it has to be a peg, because it would be the easiest means to change and pop those off and swap them out to whatever you want to go with. The torso is something I could certainly live with. It's the arms that I find are the biggest culprits in this. So if, let's say, for example, we want to change out to, let's go with like the big giant mace, and why not? We'll also go with this as well. So to pop those off, I mean, it takes little to no effort whatsoever. These can be swapped either side. It doesn't have to be specifically this side or this side here. I mean, there is a bit of customization. Pop that just back on like so. Take the ball mace and just wiggle that on. The thing I found about the mace though, I might find myself taking a screwdriver and just widening that. There's a bitter irony to the fact that on the regular forearms, the hole seems so much bigger. If you look at it side by side, and the mace seems to have such a smaller hole that I find I have to apply a lot of force to fit this onto the peg. The last thing, and certainly the one thing that I'm keeping in mind the whole time I'm doing this, if you put this on, and let's say the peg fits all the way in, if you're wiggling it, and you're not actually making any progress putting this into the forearm section of this, what you're ultimately doing is you may start twisting the plastic, and you may not realize you're twisting the plastic. And as you continue to do this, you might be twisting the plastic to the point that this peg may break off. I may go ultimately just heat this, submerge it in some boiling water, a tip of the trade, and then once that's soft enough, put it on the ball joint the first time, and that should be enough to keep this permanently in place. Funny enough though, if I take this off, the mace seems to fit better on this side, and I don't really know the reasoning for it. It still involves me putting a lot of pressure, more pressure than I really feel comfortable with, but at the very least I can actually get at least the mace on this side. So I think some hot water might be your best friend when it comes to actually putting some of these pieces on them. The other thing that you would expect to probably have happen with a figure like this is that you're adding a lot of additional weight to it. Things like his arms, and certainly even things like his torso, may develop a bit of a looseness over time with the fact that you're adding some additional weight to his forearms. Just know that when you are displaying the figure, if you have things out like this, eventually over time, it may be gradual, yes, but the forearms may eventually start getting loose. And you might start seeing the arms starting to drape down. One workaround as well to that is keeping the heavier things kind of down as if he's about to swing up and swing at Spider-Man. And then the other thing would be, like for example, I might just put this on one arm, like that. And then I'll take, let's say this arm here, and I'll put that on. And I'll probably end up just displaying the figure like this. Again, I love the sand hands. My biggest disappointment is the fact that the sand hands can't be used on both sides. I would love to see more of these. I'm still happy with these, but I would love to see some more just regular sand hands. And I don't have as much the problem with gaps. So I think what I might ultimately just do is just give up on these altogether and just go the route of something like this and perhaps like a melee weapon on the other side when it comes to displaying the figure. Then again, you can take the figure, take it on this display stand, line the pegs up to the holes. There we go. And you've got yourself a pretty neat looking Sandman. Problematic, yes, unfortunately, with the way that the peg system works. In some cases, you have things like struggles with trying to get like the ball and mace on, or the mace ball onto his hand. Or you'll be to the other extreme of things where the forearms, unfortunately, the sockets here are just way too loose. I think when it's all said and done, when it's ready to pack up shop and close up shop for the night, I'm probably just going to display the figure with one sand arm and then decide whatever melee weapon I want on the other. Figure collectors can certainly be fickle at times. Yes, I can agree, and I'm sure the narrative during this review and even the comments section down below probably are along the lines of, well, what would really make you happy? for all the good that you mentioned about the figure, there was also a lot of negative. And really, it wasn't so much negative, because I know along with the good has to be the bad. For the good, the figure does have the interchangeable melee weapons and the arms. That's something that Diamond Select definitely did do in an abundance. When you think about it, the fact that the figure has a regular standing display, which I've currently got right now, he's got a lower sand spiral that replaces out his legs, and he has multiple different interchangeable arms and different hands. There really isn't a lot negative in the figure other than just all that same stuff that I mentioned. For those to be able to swap out, ultimately means you have to go with a system that's going to be easy to change out. This means using a peg. And along with the benefit of using a peg comes the negative of things that could get either really, really loose or still continue to be really tight when you're trying to get them onto the pegs. At the end of the day, this is a decent enough looking Sandman, and really one of the better ones we've gotten in recent memory. But unfortunately with that comes things like loose waists, loose arms, or drooping forearms that don't feel like they sit perfectly in place. Diamond Select I do have to give a round of applause for giving me really a figure that I honestly didn't think I'd like in the beginning. The head portrait is something that is different than what we've gotten in the past. But what I do look at when I see this is I feel like I'm looking at a vintage episode of the classic Spider-Man cartoon, where Spider-Man, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, would be battling the sandy foe in Flint Marko. This looks like a more classic design of Sandman, and I think the more and more I look at it, the more I like it. Yes, there are negatives that can go along with the figure, the loose joints and all the things we talked about. But again, that goes with the trade-off of getting as much as we did get with this figure. And really, we have gotten some of the most that we've gotten with the Sandman figure with the release here from the Marvel Select line. So again, I have to give some kudos to Diamond Select for doing a really bang-up job on this guy. Even though he does have loose arms, loose draping forearms, and he does have a very noticeably loose waist, I guess at the end of the day, for all the positives, the pros definitely outweigh the cons. What do you guys think about the figure? Let me know down below what you guys think of the new Marvel Select Marvel's Sandman. A little too harsh on the figure? I don't think I was. I had to obviously point out the fact that there were things that were loose about it, but I think overall, I'm more happier with this figure than I am disappointed. My disappointment only comes in the way it was constructed, not the way it was sculpted, and not the way it was painted either. But let me know down below what you guys think of the Marvel Select Marvel's Sandman. Always like reading your comments down below. Make sure as well you hit that bell notification and turn on, I guess it would be the other way around, turn on that subscribe button. Swing on over. It's been a long day. Swing on over and turn on that bell notification. And stay tuned. There's going to be a whole bunch of videos coming your way. As always, guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.